Imagine walking into a hospital, seeking treatment for mild anxiety, or sitting in a local bar enjoying a drink, completely unaware that a covert operative, hiding in the shadows, has just slipped a powerful, experimental, mind-altering chemical into your glass. You haven't committed a crime, and you aren't an enemy spy. You are simply an ordinary citizen, and your own government has secretly chosen you to be a human guinea pig in a terrifying quest to master the human mind. Before we dive into the dark, declassified files of this massive conspiracy, I want to ask you all a quick question. From where are you watching this from? Let us know in the comments below. Welcome to a journey into one of the most chilling and highly classified chapters of American history. For decades, the idea that the government was kidnapping, drugging, and experimenting on its own citizens sounded like a dystopian science fiction novel. But when 7 boxes of long-forgotten financial records were miraculously uncovered in 1977, the horrifying truth was dragged into the light. The Central Intelligence Agency had indeed spent years treating real people as lab rats. To understand how this began, we have to travel back to the dawn of the Cold War in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The United States was gripped by a paralyzing fear of the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, and other communist bloc countries. American soldiers were returning home from Chinese and North Korean captivity, seemingly brainwashed. They appeared disillusioned with American values, inexplicably confessing to war crimes and overtaken by communist ideologies. The CIA received reports that the Soviet Union was producing mind-altering drugs, even attempting to purchase the entire world's supply of LSD. CIA officials became convinced that foreign powers had cracked the ultimate code, the ability to hack, reprogram, and control the human brain. The agency felt it had no choice but to fight fire with fire, as noted in a declassified 1952 memorandum. The memo argued that because communists were utilizing drugs and electric shock, the U.S. was forced to take a more aggressive role. The foray into behavioral modification began with the Navy in 1947 under Project Chatter, testing substances like mescaline on subjects. But the CIA soon took the reins, determined to expand. In 1950, they approved Project Bluebird to enhance memory and investigate control. In August 1951, Bluebird became Project Artichoke, designed to study hypnosis and forced addiction to produce vulnerable states. One memo asked if they could get control of an individual to make them do their bidding, even against the laws of nature. The CIA explicitly wanted to know if they could create unwitting assassins who would have no memory of their actions. The CIA utilized secret black sites across Europe and Asia, where subjects were thrown into total sensory isolation. Victims were subjected to extremes of temperature, electroshocked, and interrogated while being administered psychoactive drugs. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles authorized a new umbrella project cryptonamed MKUltra. It was placed under Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who would become the chief architect of the CIA's mind control empire. Because they knew this was unethical, they bypassed normal procedures and created fake research foundations to funnel millions of dollars. The scale was staggering: 149 sub-projects at 80 institutions, including 44 colleges and 12 hospitals. Gottlieb was particularly obsessed with LSD, viewing it as the holy grail of mind control. The CIA purchased the entire global supply of LSD, enough for 100 million doses, so other nations couldn't control it. They specifically targeted people who could not fight back. In one case, a mental patient was given LSD for 174 consecutive days. At one facility, prisoners were bribed into taking hallucinogenic drugs in exchange for heroin. Gottlieb wanted to know what would happen if a normal citizen going about their life was plunged into a trip without their consent. And so, the CIA crossed the ultimate ethical line, secretly slipping LSD into the food and drinks of unsuspecting Americans. There was no prior consent, no medical pre-screening, and no doctors on hand to observe the effects. This reckless testing claimed the life of one of their own top scientists, plunging the program into a massive cover-up. In November 1953, deep in the remote woods of western Maryland, high-level government scientists gathered at a secluded cabin near Deep Creek Lake. They were researchers from the CIA and the Army's Special Operations Division at Camp Detrick, the epicenter of America's biological weapons program. Among them was Dr. Frank Olson, an expert in aerobiology who had spent years working on top-secret projects for the military and the CIA. The men were there for a review conference, but McGill chief Dr. Sidney Gottlieb had a different, darker agenda. On Thursday evening, after dinner, the scientists relaxed with a bottle of Cointreau. Gottlieb and his deputy, Robert Lashbrook, had secretly spiked the liqueur with a heavy dose of LSD. Gottlieb casually informed them that they had just been made unwitting participants in a mind control experiment. For Frank Olson, the sudden, forced exposure to the powerful hallucinogen triggered a catastrophic psychological break. The next morning, Olson returned home a changed man. He refused to eat and sat distant from his children. He chillingly confessed to his wife, "I've made a terrible mistake." Lashbrook and the CIA escorted Olson to New York City to see Dr. Harold Abramson, an immunologist secretly funded by MKUltra. On the night of November 28, 1953, Frank Olson plunged to his death from the 10th floor of the Statler Hotel in Manhattan. Lashbrook told police he had no idea why Olson would commit suicide, noting only that the scientist suffered from ulcers. The CIA immediately initiated a massive cover-up, telling Olson's family he had simply suffered a fatal nervous breakdown. It would take until the 1975 Rockefeller Commission investigations for the government to admit Olson had been secretly drugged. When Olson's body was exhumed in 1994, forensic evidence revealed blunt force cranial injuries that occurred before he went out the window. Instead of stopping after this tragedy, the CIA doubled down. Under Cold War logic, they believed they had to maintain an offensive capability. This directive gave birth to one of the most bizarre and illegal operations in intelligence history, Operation Midnight Climax. In 1954, Gottlieb enlisted George Hunter White, a seasoned narcotics agent, to set up clandestine safe houses. The CIA hired local prostitutes to lure unsuspecting men back to the agency's safe houses. Once inside, the men were surreptitiously given drinks laced with massive doses of LSD. White and other operatives hid in the next room, watching through two-way mirrors installed in the bedrooms. They secretly tape-recorded the sessions, observing how the unwitting men reacted to the potent hallucinogens. CIA operatives began dosing randomly selected citizens in restaurants, at beaches, and in local bars. The operatives even commissioned a stage magician to write a secret manual on sleight-of-hand tricks and pill dropping. They targeted people unlikely to complain: criminals, drug addicts, and those too embarrassed to go to authorities. For nearly a decade, Operation Midnight Climax turned the streets into a giant, covert laboratory. But MKUltra was about to move out of the seedy underworld and into the pristine, trusted halls of modern medicine. What happens when the CIA decides to fund a respected psychiatrist to literally wipe the minds of his patients clean. In our last chapter, we witnessed the Central Intelligence Agency move its mind control experiments out of clinical laboratories and into the real world. They were secretly dosing unsuspecting American citizens with LSD in covert safe houses. But as shocking as Operation Midnight Climax was, the CIA's quest to dominate the human psyche was about to take an even darker turn. They wanted a method to systematically erase a person's memory, dismantle their personality, and reprogram them from scratch. To achieve this, the CIA turned northward to Canada, funding horrific procedures known as the Montreal experiments. At the foot of Mount Royal sits an ominous stone mansion, formerly known as Ravenscrag. In the 1950s, this building housed the Allen Memorial Institute, the psychiatric department of the Royal Victoria Hospital. The director was Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, one of the most eminent and highly respected psychiatrists in the world. Ironically, he had even been a member of the Nuremberg Medical Tribunal, prosecuting Nazi doctors for their horrific human experiments. Cameron believed the human mind could be cured if memories were completely wiped away, a process he called depatterning. Once the mind was a blank slate, he believed he could rebuild it using a technique he dubbed psychic driving. In 1957, the CIA officially recruited Cameron's research under MKUltra, designating it as Subproject 68. They used a front organization to funnel $69,000, the equivalent of over $760,000 today, directly to Cameron. The subjects were not spies. They were everyday citizens seeking help for minor anxiety, depression, or postpartum depression. Upon entering Cameron's care, patients were subjected to the first phase, depatterning. Cameron used massive doses of drugs to plunge patients into an artificial coma in what was known as the sleep room. To truly shatter their memories, Cameron utilized extreme, intensive electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. He administered massive doses of electroshock at 30 to 40 times the normal power, 2 to 4 times every single day. Cameron coldly documented that patients would show a total loss of marital status and secondary languages, reduced to a helpless state. Once the mind was broken, Phase 2 began, psychic driving. Patients were forced to listen to pre-recorded audio messages, played on a continuous loop for up to 16 hours a day. The aftermath was utterly devastating. Patients were released with profound, permanent brain damage, forgetting their own families. Cameron's research essentially laid the clinical foundation for the CIA's modern two-stage psychological torture and interrogation methods. But what happens when the intelligence community takes these psychological weapons into secret, overseas detention camps? In our last chapter, we uncovered the chilling reality of the Montreal experiments, where the CIA systematically wiped away memories using extreme electroshock and drugs. But as horrific as those experiments were, they were still confined to North America. What happens when the CIA moves its operations completely off the grid? Welcome to Part 4. Today, we are opening the darkest declassified files, stepping into overseas black sites to explore the quest for the ultimate programmed assassin. To understand this escalation, we must look at the direct predecessors to MKUltra, Project Bluebird and Project Artichoke. In 1950, during the Korean War, the CIA launched Project Bluebird. Initially, it was a defensive posture to help agents resist brainwashing from communist forces. However, this defensive program rapidly mutated. A 1952 memo revealed the paranoia, noting evidence that communists utilized drugs, electric shock, and possibly hypnosis against enemies. Project Bluebird was renamed Project Artichoke in 1951. Its goal, to control an individual so completely they would act against their own will and self-preservation. They were researching how to use hypnosis and drugs to create an assassin, someone who could murder a politician and have absolutely no memory of the act. To conduct these illegal experiments, the CIA established secret black sites in Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines, shielding themselves from criminal prosecution. Inside, subjects were not volunteers, but prisoners and foreign nationals categorized as expendable. With no legal protections, the CIA unleashed a nightmare of psychological harassment. Prisoners faced sensory isolation, temperature extremes, and electroshock. Agents used sodium pentothal and hypnosis, but they soon found LSD to be their most devastating tool. According to declassified records, one agent was drugged on LSD for 77 consecutive days. Survivors were left traumatized, their minds fogged with chemically induced amnesia. The agency also needed a physical arsenal of untraceable biological agents. This led to Project MKUltra, a joint operation with the Department of Defense. At Fort Detrick, Maryland, the CIA weaponized diseases like dengue fever. They developed dart guns to silently incapacitate guards and stockpiled lethal biological materials. They even hoarded lethal shellfish toxin. Although President Nixon ordered its destruction in 1970, a CIA scientist secretly hid 11 grams of it for another 5 years. Project QK Hilltop extended this reach into American academia, studying brainwashing techniques at Cornell University under a covert funding front to maintain absolute secrecy. By the late 1950s, the CIA had built a vast empire of behavioral modification, from local bars to overseas black sites, disregarding human rights and ethics. But an empire built on such foundations cannot stay hidden. Eventually, the scale of abuses and risk of exposure began to close in on the architects. What happens when a panicked director issues a sudden order to burn every paper and medical file before the public can find out? By the early 1970s, the Central Intelligence Agency had spent 2 decades treating the United States and Canada as a massive, covert laboratory. They had slipped potent hallucinogens into the drinks of unwitting citizens in local bars. They had funded the systematic destruction of human memories in pristine psychiatric hospitals. They had secretly tested biological toxins and paralyzing darts, and tortured expendable prisoners in black sites scattered across the globe. But an empire built on such reckless, illegal, and morally devastating foundations cannot operate in the shadows forever. Welcome to the 5th and final part of our series. Today, we look at the desperate scramble to burn the evidence and the accidental discovery that dragged Project MKUltra into the light. The beginning of the end for McGill was triggered by a rising tide of political paranoia. In 1973, the U.S. government was gripped by Watergate. As walls closed in on the Nixon administration, the CIA realized congressional investigators would soon be turned onto their own covert operations. Director Richard Helms and Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the chief architect of MKUltra, made a chilling decision. They knew that the files they left behind contained the terrifying proof of decades of illegal human experimentation. Helms coldly rationalized that they should simply get rid of the files to avoid embarrassment or follow-up questions. In early 1973, Helms issued a direct, verbal order to Dr. Gottlieb: destroy everything.
Within days, massive volumes of the MKUltra records, medical files, reports, and victim identities were fed into the incinerators. The destruction was thorough. By erasing the paper trail, the CIA guaranteed that a complete investigation into MKUltra would be impossible. Tragically, they destroyed any chance of locating and providing medical assistance to surviving victims whose minds had been shattered. For a brief moment, it seemed the CIA had successfully buried its darkest secret. But the truth has a funny way of surviving the flames. In December 1974, journalist Seymour Hersh published a bombshell report in the New York Times, alleging massive, illegal domestic operations. In response, the U.S. government launched investigations, most notably the Rockefeller Commission and the Senate's Church Committee. In 1975, the Church Committee shocked the world by revealing covert experiments to influence human behavior using psychoactive drugs like LSD. They also revealed the tragic death of Dr. Frank Olson, who plunged to his death after being secretly dosed with LSD by Dr. Gottlieb. Because of the 1973 purge, investigators relied on sworn testimony. Many participants suddenly suffered from convenient institutional amnesia. The CIA confidently assured the Senate that the rest of the records were gone, but they had made one monumental bureaucratic mistake. In 1977, journalist John Marks filed a FOA request. A diligent CIA employee searched an area no one had thought to check. He went to the Retired Records Center and opened the archives of the Budget and Fiscal section. Inside these boxes, the employee found 20,000 pages of surviving MKUltra documents. They contained the smoking guns. The documents revealed 185 researchers and 80 institutions used by the CIA, including 44 colleges and 12 hospitals. Testing had taken place in safe houses in San Francisco and New York on criminal psychopaths and terminal cancer patients. In August 1977, Senator Ted Kennedy convened a joint hearing. Admiral Stansfield Turner publicly presented the contents of the 20,000 pages. Kennedy demanded to know how the government could ever properly notify and treat citizens walking around with severe psychological damage. But if you are waiting for the architects of MKUltra to be marched out in handcuffs, you will be deeply disappointed. Despite the violations, no CIA official involved ever faced criminal prosecution. Most evidence had been reduced to ash. Following revelations, Frank Olson's family sued for wrongful death. The government eventually paid $750,000 by a special act of Congress. In Canada, survivors of Ewan Cameron's horrific electroshock experiments in Montreal received $100,000 each after a grueling legal fight. Yet, the CIA fought to maintain secrecy. The battle for names went to the Supreme Court in the 1985 case, CIA versus Sims. The court ruled in favor of the CIA, granting near-total immunity from the FOIA and reinforcing the agency's discretionary powers. President Ford issued an executive order in 1976 explicitly prohibiting experimentation with drugs on human subjects without informed, written consent. Today, the CIA maintains that it no longer conducts testing on human beings. MKUltra is officially dead, but the legacy of those missing files and the ghosts of the unwitting lab rats continue to haunt the American consciousness. Project MKUltra shattered the ultimate illusion, the belief that A democratic government would never turn its weapons of war inward. They proved that when a nation operates in total secrecy, unbound by ethics and fueled by fear, the human mind is no longer a sanctuary. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the declassified brain files of the CIA.